There was a guy by the name of Benedict Arnold. He was an American general during the Revolutionary War who betrayed his country and became synonymous with the word traitor. He was born on January 14th, 1741. Arnold was raised in a respected family in Norwich, Connecticut. He apprenticed with an apothecary and was a member of the militia during the French and Indian War. And he later became a successful trader and joined the Continental Army when the Revolutionary War broke out between Great Britain and its 13 American colonies in 1775. During the war, Arnold proved himself to be a brave, skilled leader, helping Ethan Allen's troops during the capture of Fort Ticonderoga in 1775, and then taking part in the unsuccessful attack of British Quebec later that year, which earned him a promotion to brigadier general. And he was very distinguished throughout the various campaigns and gained support of George Washington. However, Arnold had enemies within the military, and in 1777, a group of lower-ranking men were promoted ahead of him. Over the next several years, Arnold married a second time, and he and his wife led a lavish lifestyle in Philadelphia, racking up substantial debt. Money problems and the resentment Arnold felt over not being promoted faster were factors in his decision to become a turncoat. In 1780, Arnold was given command of West Point, the American fort on the Hudson River in New York, future home of the United States Military Academy. And Arnold contacted Sir Henry Clinton, head of the British forces, proposed handing over West Point and its men. And on September 21st of that year, Arnold met with Major John Andre and made his traitorous pact, in which the American was to receive a large sum of money and a high position in the British Army. However, the conspiracy was uncovered. Andre was captured and killed, and Arnold fled to the enemy's side and went on to lead British troops in Virginia and Connecticut. Later moved to England, though he never received all of what he had been promised by the British. The former American hero and patriot died in London in relative obscurity on June 14th, 1801. See, oftentimes when you hear of a Benedict Arnold, you think of a traitor. See, and when you mention a traitor, you get various images in your mind. Some people get to the idea of someone, a friend, who has backstabbed them. For military personnel, nothing is worse than someone that abandons their post to join the other side. And Paul begins his letter to the Galatian church with this imagery. In Galatians 1 verse 6, I am astonished that you are so quickly deserting him who called you in the grace of God and are turning to a different gospel. I am astonished that you are deserting him and turning to a different gospel. And this is why I have came up with the most awesomest, coolest sermon title ever. Whoa! Did Paul just call Christians deserting traitors? I told my wife and my friend Ryan this, and they just laughed at me. They're like, is that your title? Yes, it is. Exactly. And I know you guys are in such awe of that. This letter is up front. It is in your face. And if read in context, from what I believe after reading it a few times, is far more blunt than James's letter to his readers. And those of us who have studied James and read are like, whoa, he can say that? Yeah. As we see, Paul's a little more so. He says they've been bewitched. He calls them fools. You saw how he implied that they were traitors. He even gets really close. He even gets telling the leaders who are leading this, he wants to put them under a curse. And he uses other colorful imagery. So what is the problem? All right, because these are some very heated words. Could you imagine if I got up here and said, you guys have all been bewitched? And I hear Alec, since he's laughing a little louder, I'll pick on him. I hear Alec is leading this rebellion. And, I'm going to place him under a curse. I don't know what this is. Maybe Montezuma's curse. Sorry, buddy. Yeah. Call y'all traitors. That's Carlene. And, yeah, we can take it out. Yeah, exactly. How would that make you feel? Come on. See, she gets it, okay? You get a brownie point today, okay? You're nailing it. You get a gold star. Okay. So what is the problem? We're going to just sort of try to walk through Galatians. And usually in our first message, we try to get just a good general picture of what we're studying here. So what's the problem? What's going on? Well, look at verse 6 of chapter 1. He says, I am astonished that you have quickly, so it's not like this has happened slowly over time, where, I can see where you messed up. Let's get you back on track. No, they have quickly deserted. They have abandoned, what he says is they have abandoned him who called them in the grace of Christ. And they have turned to something different than what Paul had been teaching, a different gospel. Look at that next verse. And I like how he clarifies this. Not that there is another one. See, there's only one gospel. There's only one good news. So he's actually saying, yeah, you went to a different gospel, but actually you didn't even go to that. You're not even following the gospel at all. And he says, and there are some who trouble you. These are the leaders here, and want to distort the gospel of Christ. Have you ever put on glasses that didn't quite match your prescription? For me, anytime I wear anybody's glasses, it's like not quite right. It's distorted. The image, after a while, I end up getting a huge headache from wearing glasses, and it just distorts. And he says, these leaders and even you are falling for, here was the gospel so clearly laid out in front of you, and now you guys have just distorted it. And it's mangled, and it doesn't even look right. In chapter 2, Paul shares an account and shares how Paul and the great apostle Peter, the leader, actually get in front argument / Paul rebuking Peter over this issue. This viewpoint, this distortion was dividing the church, splitting it up, and actually reestablish ethnic boundaries. That the cross and what Jesus was doing was actually uniting them. This was actually breaking and tearing this apart again. And look at Galatians 2:18. And it sounds like this group, he says, for if I rebuild what I tore down, I prove myself to be a transgressor. As in Jesus and what he has done has torn this down, and now you're trying to put it back up again? Could you imagine if they tried to rebuild the Berlin Wall? That's exactly, how ridiculous would that be? This is silly. Why are you rebuilding what has already been torn down? And then he says in verse 21, he says, I do not nullify the grace of God, for if righteousness were through the law, then Christ died for no purpose. And we start getting a hint at what's going on here. This problem, whatever it was actually declaring the death of Jesus as a pointless endeavor. That's what Paul says here. If you follow this viewpoint of righteousness is through the law, then what you are saying is there was no reason whatsoever that Jesus Christ had to die. Then he says in chapter 3, verse 10, he says, for all who rely on the works of the law are under a curse. For it is written, cursed be everyone who does not abide by all things written in the book of the law and do them. He's saying by following this viewpoint, this distortion of the gospel, by getting involved with this, you've actually placed you've placed yourselves under a cursed, pointless system. Is willingly walking into, it's like you know this city has the Black Plague, and you know you're going to get it with 100% if you walk in there. You know it, you've seen it, and you do it anyway. Why are you doing this? He asks. And then throughout chapter 3, he builds on this. He's like, not only are you placing yourself under a curse in your claim and in your belief that you're actually abiding and fulfilling and living out the New Testament or the Old Testament, he actually shows them that this whole system actually makes no sense biblically either. So far what he has said is by following this distortion, this righteousness through the law, it is ignorant of what the Old Testament actually teaches. It is declaring the death of Jesus Christ as pointless. It is saying that if you abide by it, have stepped and are walking into a cursed system. Then he says in chapter 4, and he says, look at chapter 4, verse 1. He says, I mean that the heir, as long as he is a child, is no different from a slave, though he is an owner of everything. But he is under guardians and managers until the date set by his father. In the same way, also, we were enslaved to the elementary principles of the world. So now he's gone from you're cursed, it's ignorant, it is a pointless thing. He now shifts and says, actually, this group claims that they are wiser, older, more spiritual, that they have the answers here. He says, nope, actually, you are living like children, still in need of a nanny. Oh. Could you imagine me telling you that? Exactly. He is just blah. And then he says in chapter 5, verse 4, I mean, so far we have this, one right after the next. And then he says in chapter 4, as he's building his argument here, he actually says this, which it is brutal. I mean, all the other things were brutal, but this, you are severed, verse 4, you are severed from Christ. You who would be justified by the law, you have fallen away from grace. You are completely cut off from Jesus. And from a Christian perspective of a group of people who claim that they follow Jesus, I think this is probably the most brutal insult. I mean, the other ones are bad. But just this reality that you who claim Christ, you don't even know him. You are severed. You have been cut off from him. And then in a few verses later, he says in verse 12, which every once in a while you are surprised that there are verses in the Bible like this. I wish those who unsettle you would emasculate themselves. Paul is not holding back. And I think with the passion and the severity that he approaches this, I think it should have us slow down a little bit and really try to understand what Paul is saying. Because we've seen a lot of his other writings. We finished our study in 2 Timothy. We've read Romans. We've seen and read Colossians. And we've done the 1st and 2nd Thessalonians. His tone, he is frustrated at times. I think we can see that. But the way that he attacks this righteousness through the law, it's pretty serious. And so, as we'll see in Galatians, there's the problem. So it says so here's the problem. I'm trying to summarize it for us, but this group was trying to rely on other things, such as the law, instead of faith in Jesus Christ and his finished work on the cross. See, these false teachers were trying to get the Galatian Christians to depend upon circumcision, the 10 Commandments, and the rest of the law to bring them to maturity in Christ. See, the false teachers were trying to get the Galatian Christians to depend upon circumcision, the 10 Commandments, and the rest of the law to bring them to maturity in Christ. And this obedience to the law would also have other impacts. I think that Paul seemed to sort of narrow in why the teachers were doing what they were doing. And we see this at the end of chapter 6. He seems to believe that these Christians believed that if they followed the law, they would no longer be persecuted. So maybe some of them had a spiritual in-your-face and better-than-you mentality. Some seem to have actually been scared of what was happening. And they're like, maybe if we merge these two together, things won't be so bad for us. And as like all things, people are pretty complicated. Could have been a few reasons. And so we've talked about this problem and how things are and Paul's approach and how he's going about it and how he's teaching it. And does he give a solution here in Galatians? And so look at Galatians chapter 5, verses 1 through 6. I think this is just a really good summary of what Paul says in previous chapters, and then how Paul then uses Galatians 5 and 6 to point them to something better. And it's Galatians 5, 1 through 6. And I would like to just pause right here. Because of Galatians and how it approaches topics and, his verbiage and all that, I thought it would be just a good challenge for us as a church over the course of our study to actually memorize Galatians 5, verses 1 through 6. Because it is such what I believe is an incredible way of summarizing the book, it is also a great reminder for you as a Christian. And we're going to dig deeper into Galatians 5, 1 through 6. When we get there, we're going to build the argument from Galatians 1 all the way to 5. And so we'll get here because we're going to make sure we catch what Paul is trying to say as we get here to Galatians 5. But I wanted just to briefly summarize what he's trying to communicate in connection with the book. And he says here in Galatians 5, he says, "For freedom Christ has set us free. Stand firm, therefore, and do not submit again to a yoke of slavery. Look, I, Paul, say to you that if you accept circumcision, Christ will be of no advantage to you. I testify again to every man who accepts circumcision that he is obligated to keep the whole law. You are severed from Christ, you who would be justified by the law. You have fallen away from grace. For through the Spirit, by faith, we ourselves eagerly wait for the hope of righteousness. For in Christ Jesus, neither circumcision nor uncircumcision counts for anything, but only faith working through love." See what he says in verse 1? He says, this is based on his argument that we're going to see over the next, I think the series will take about 17 weeks. He says in verse 1, he says, "For freedom Christ has set us free, therefore stand firm." And what he's saying is, stand firm in what Christ has done for you. Do not fall back again into a yoke of slavery. Remember, he called them traitors. He said they are deserting their post. They're deserting the gospel. They are falling under a trap that is going to get them nothing but pain and a curse. And it's just, ugh. He says, I want you to stand firm and do not, under any circumstance, go back and get trapped under the slavery of following the law. And if you look at what he said, you guys are probably familiar with the verse in James. Now that I just brought it up, I can't remember it. Scratch that. All right, we'll scratch the James, and it'll come to me like in an hour. You see what he says here? He says, in verse 3, if you accept circumcision, which is one aspect over 613 various Old Testament laws, when he's talking about the whole law, that is all 613. When you accept one of 613, you are placing yourselves under all 613. You can't pick and choose here. He says if you accept one, you are obligated to keep all of them. And if you do that, you've been severed from Christ. You have fallen away from grace. And he says here in verse 5, which is the next thing, for through the Spirit, by faith, we eagerly wait for the hope of righteousness, which I think is a neat idea, which I'm excited to study here. But not only are they to stand firm in what Jesus has done, in the gospel, the true gospel. If you look at verse 5, he's saying that if you have this, it actually creates hope for the future, eagerly waiting with hope. That's neat. And then this one in verse 6, which is, whoa. If we really slow down and really think about this, he says, for in Christ Jesus, neither circumcision nor uncircumcision. So literally, like, the law doesn't mean anything. It doesn't count for anything. This is what matters. For in Christ Jesus, this stuff doesn't matter. Only one thing matters. And that is faith working through love. He wants them to stop foolishly falling back into slavery and human bondage and instead live with unchained love through faith in Jesus Christ. Paul wants these Christians in these churches of Galatia to stop foolishly falling back into slavery and human bondage and instead live with unchained love through faith in Jesus Christ. And this is the argument that he's going to be building throughout the whole book. He builds the story. He begins with himself and how the gospel impacted him, and he gives his personal testimony. He then is going to build the story sort of historically, and he's going to zero in specifically on the Old Testament, and he's going to start presenting arguments that the false teachers have been making, and he's going to just smack them down. And then as he shifts and you're left with this, but if there's not this, what do I do? Where am I supposed to go? Don't I need a guide? Don't I need help? And he's like, no. You don't need a nanny anymore. You don't need a school teacher anymore. You can grow up now and live like you don't need to. And just like any high schooler who graduates, they're excited to live their life. But what's generally the question? Well, now what do I do? And that's what he gets into in Galatians 5 and 6. And he paints and opens up this picture of what faith in Christ Jesus looks like. And it looks like unchained, unhindered